Ben Gill from To The Point English joins me this week to talk about Cambridge exams and how you can prepare for them. And with around 7 million English students taking Cambridge exams every year, perhaps it's something you might consider. Welcome to Aprender Inglés with Ben and Craig. Hello, and if you are a new listener to the podcast, you're very, very welcome. And if you've come back to listen again, thank you for your company. My name's Craig, and my usual co-host Reza is not with me this week, but my friend Ben is. Now, Ben is an English teacher with many, many years of experience and with a successful YouTube channel called To The Point English. Like me, Ben also lives here in Spain and he teaches online, creating courses and videos to help you prepare for exams. On his YouTube channel, Ben has created a wide selection of videos to help you get ready for the Cambridge B2, C1 and C2 exams so that you have the best chance possible of getting a high score when you take those exams. Ben joins me this week to talk about Cambridge exams, and he explains how you can avoid mistakes in your exam preparation. So please enjoy my conversation with Ben Gill from To The Point English. Ben, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on here. How are you?
Thank you for having me, Craig. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very well, thanks.
I want to start by asking you a question, Ben, that I ask guests when they come on the show, and that's where is your accent from, so that the listeners can get an idea of where you're from?
Right, yeah, there's a short answer to that and a slightly longer answer, but the short answer is it's a standard Southern British English accent. The slightly longer answer is that I was born on the outskirts of London in a little area called Romford. So until I was 6, I lived there, and then we moved to a village in Cambridgeshire, which is still southern England, southeast England. So I had a strong sort of Cockney accent until I moved there, and over the years I lost that London accent. And I've been living and teaching English in Spain for the last 20 years, so I've really lost that London accent completely.
Yeah, the similar thing happened to me because I was born and grew up in Essex, so I had quite a Cockney accent when I was younger. And through teaching probably and living abroad and speaking to people with different accents, my accent's changed as well. I think that's quite common.
Yeah. I think we have to consciously or subconsciously adapt the way we speak a little bit so our students understand us. But yeah, when I go home, sometimes my friends think it's a little bit strange the way I speak.
Do you hear your accent changing when you're among your friends and family? Does it go back to a little bit to what it was before?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And it depends on the friends. If I'm with friends who are from London, for example, then my London accent really comes back. If I'm with my friends from Cambridgeshire, it's a slightly different accent. So yeah, I think people who have lived abroad for some years, we're kind of a bit lost with our accents. We adapt our accents depending on who we're talking to, where we are, and what the situation is. So, yeah. But as I said, basically my accent is a standard Southern British English accent, which is very similar to sort of a BBC accent, which is, I think, many people are more familiar with.
People are familiar with the BBC and they're also very familiar with YouTube. And that's why I wanted to talk to you today, because on YouTube, on your very successful channel, To The Point English, you tend to produce very useful videos focused on Cambridge exams. So my first question, Ben, is there are many exams, aren't there? There's the IELTS, the APTIS, the Cambridge, we say suite or selection or variety of exams, and the TOEFL exams. If a student wants to take an exam, which would you recommend they study for and why?
Yeah, it's a good question. First of all, I have to say that I don't always recommend that students take any exam. I mean, many people need the certification for various reasons, to get a job, to university applications. Sometimes they want to live in an English-speaking country, but it's not always the best way of improving your English. For some people, it's really good for motivation to sort of have organized studies. And I think many people just like to have a certificate to prove their level, really. But the question as to which exam I recommend students study, it does depend on what they need or want the certification for. For example, TOEFL is more for the USA area. It's more in demand there. IELTS and Cambridge are more for the UK region. And another important consideration students have to take into account is the validity of the exams. I mean, for example, the IELTS and TOEFL expire after 2 years. They're only valid for 2 years. The Cambridge exams are valid forever. But of course, it depends on, for example, if an employer, a company require or ask for a Cambridge certificate, their policy may be to ask for a certificate that is from the last 2 or 5 years, for example. So if you just want to take an exam for motivational purposes or to prove to yourself that you can pass the exam, I would recommend the Cambridge English exams because I think they're the most prestigious exams for many people. Everybody knows Cambridge, the Cambridge University, and I think they're more valuable in general, not for a specific purpose, but I think, if you just want a certificate for possible future use, but nothing in particular now, most employers, know about and respect the Cambridge English exams. And as I said, they're valid forever.
So they're valid forever. So just to clarify, if you take a Cambridge exam now and you pass B2 or C1, 10, 20 years from now, you still have that B2 or C1 exam certification, even though your English has got progressively worse over those years.
Exactly. It doesn't expire. So that is the case. That's the fact. But as I said, I think most employers would probably specify that they need a C1 advanced certification that has, from the last 5 or 10 years. But I think for me, that's the best option because it's up to the employer then to decide. For IELTS, for example, after 2 years, it's very difficult to plan your future. If you may think, I want the IELTS for university access or university application, but maybe something changes in your life and you have to delay everything. And then, 2 years later, the certification is not valid. So I think it's more logical to have a certification that is valid forever, but it's up to the institution to decide whether they accept that certificate as it is or they prefer a more recent certificate.
That makes a lot of sense. So I know that your YouTube channel reaches students around the world. Would you say that the majority of your students are Spanish speakers, or are they a selection of students from different nationalities?
Yeah, there are a lot of Spanish students from Spain in particular because, as you probably know, Craig, Spanish teachers need the C1 advanced certification to teach in Spanish schools now. So it's really a necessity for them. But having said that, there are a lot of Italians looking to pass the Cambridge English exams, Polish, Russians, Romanians, all over Europe really, and some South American countries too. So it is a really international qualification, an international exam.
So I know this is quite a generalization, but from your exposure teaching people how to prepare for exams, Spanish speakers and speakers of other languages, what areas of the exam, the Cambridge exams, tend to cause the most problems for students when they're studying for the exam? Is there anything that stands out and becomes obvious to you and you think, well, yes, maybe the grammar is a difficult area when they're taking an exam, a Cambridge exam, or is it the listening, the speaking? Can you explain if there's anything that really seems obvious to you that's a problem area?
Yeah, definitely. I think if you ask a student what their problematic areas are, they would probably say the use of English and maybe some specific parts of the use of English, like part 2, for example, or, open, close, or part 4, the keyword transformation, or the gapped text of the reading. And that's true. Those are particularly difficult parts. And even the listening, multiple matching, the last part of the listening for the C1 advanced and C2 proficiency is very difficult. But in my opinion, as a teacher, most students struggle with the writing. If you look at the results statements that students get, not always, but in most cases, the writing is the lowest score on the statement. And the reason
That's
for
interesting.
that...
Yeah, I did that. That's my next question. What's the reason for that? Do you think it's because we're writing less and we're texting all the time and we're not used to long form writing? Do you think that's one of the reasons?
I think it is. And I think students just avoid practicing the writing paper in general. They don't like... It's not fun, but it's easier just to practice some use of English questions. For example, you can do that on your own, and you can improve your approach and your strategy to the use of English and reading and time management and things like that. The same with the listening. You can do lots of listening sample papers, and your answer is either right or wrong. It's black and white. But with the writing, to sit down with a blank page and start writing an essay, in my experience, students tend to find that the least appealing part of the exam preparation. So a lot of students just don't practice, or they just practice like 2 weeks or 1 week before the exam. They don't get any feedback and they don't really understand. Because, for example, with the C1 Advanced, you have to write 2 compositions in 90 minutes. So that's 45 minutes for 2 compositions. It's very limited time. And if you don't practice beforehand, you're going to find it very, very difficult.
Maybe one of the reasons is it's difficult for them to get feedback on their writing. Obviously, they can get in touch with you, look at your course and get you to help them with that. Or there's something called Write and Improve. I don't know if you've heard of that by Cambridge, which is AI, artificial intelligence. Do you think that's any good? Have you tried it?
I think it's still at early stages, so I'm sure it will be very good in the future. I think it's not great at the moment from the feedback that I've been getting from my students. It's better than nothing. If you have no other way of getting feedback, then Write and Improve is a good option. But I think it will be improved over the next few years, I'm sure, and it will get better. But there are some teething issues with it, perhaps. But hopefully they're just teething issues, just initial problems at the beginning. It's very new technology, but as you said, in fact, I have my preparation courses, which are 100% online, but I've recently offered the option that when somebody purchases one of my courses, I give them the opportunity of joining a Telegram group with other students, and I can give them feedback through that. So, it's very difficult to help everybody with the writing and speaking, because you need time to sit down and help them, on a one-to-one basis. And I read that there are something like 7 million students take the Cambridge English exams every year. So there's a lot of demand, and maybe not enough teachers.
For sure. So if anyone wants to reach out to Ben for help with the writing, the links in the show notes will be at inglespodcast.com/Ben. Now, Ben, you mentioned the speaking test. You touched on that for a second. In my experience, students get very, very anxious and nervous before the speaking test, and they tend to think it's maybe one of the more difficult parts of the exam. Do you have any tips and advice on how they can prepare for the speaking?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's completely natural. That's the first thing I want to say, because nobody likes being judged in general, but especially when you're speaking a second language. It's a very unnatural situation to be in, sort of being in a room with strangers, the interlocutor, the assessor, your partner who perhaps you've probably just met, and they're literally judging your level of English. And there's a lot to think about too. You're trying to think about your fluency, the interaction with your partner, using advanced grammar and vocabulary. It's a really difficult situation, and you have very little time. The obvious tip for preparing is to practice. Of course, to practice as much as possible. Under exam conditions, if possible. I mean that by timing yourself when, all the parts of the exam have sort of some kind of time limit. Find a study buddy. That's one of my biggest tips for exam preparation in general. If you can find a friend to practice with, even if your friend isn't planning on taking the exam or any exam, just find someone who's prepared to practice with you, especially the speaking, just to interact with them. Also, record yourself when you're speaking. In all of the exams, you have this long turn where you have to speak on your own for either 1 or 2 minutes, depending on the exam. And that's really tough, to speak on your own with no interruptions, knowing that there's no escape, really. You just have to speak for this length of time. So if you record yourself, it's horrible. It's a horrible experience recording yourself and listening back. But you get a feeling for being in that situation. it's a slightly more high pressure situation because you know you're recording yourself. So it creates that, or it simulates the feeling of being nervous. But in general, to put yourself in uncomfortable situations when you're speaking, because it is an uncomfortable situation. And as I said with the writing, if the first time you practice the writing is on the day of the exam, you're going to find it much more difficult than if you practice it before. So you can practice on your own, as I said, just recording yourself, imagining the questions. But if you could just find a friend or a family member to ask you typical Cambridge exam speaking questions, and then maybe interact with you, then you're going to find it so beneficial.
Yeah, I agree. It's very, very powerful. In fact, at the moment, we're doing that in the conversation course I'm running with students who want to improve their fluency, and we're spending a lot of time focusing on recording voice and sending it to me, and I'm checking it. I think that's a wonderful way to improve. And as you said, it's really difficult when you have to do these tasks in the speaking test, and they're not normal tasks that you would do when you're speaking on a day-to-day basis. When was the last time, Ben, you described a picture for a minute? It's not a very realistic speaking task. So I think if you try and do and prepare yourself for the speaking test, focusing in on exactly what they're going to ask you in the exam, get to know the technique, get to know the questions, the format, and practice that. That's a really good way to increase your confidence and boost your confidence on the day.
Yeah, I think there's one thing you have to understand about the Cambridge English exams, and I guess all English exams. It's a lot about strategy. It's a lot about knowing how to approach each part of the exam. Yeah, I agree. It's a very artificial situation, comparing two pictures and speaking about them on your own for a minute. So it's not only about having the required level of English, it's also about knowing how to do the task. And really, by practicing it under exam conditions as much as possible, that's the best thing you can do. So, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and that's really my final question. I mean, what other advice would you have on how a student can prepare in general for the B2, the C1 or the C2 Cambridge exams? We've already spoken about recording your voice, writing practice. Any other advice?
The first thing you need to do, again, probably for any exam, well, definitely for any exam, is to get to know the format of the exam. Really get to know it like the back of your hand. Get to know every detail about every part of the exam. That's the first thing you should do. I also recommend with the Cambridge exams to download the Cambridge Handbook for Teachers. So it could be the B2 First Cambridge Handbook for Teachers, C1 Advanced, or the C2 Proficiency. They're completely free. You just Google, for example, C1 Advanced Cambridge Handbook for Teachers, and you'll download the PDF immediately. That contains all the information you could need. I mean, it's for teachers, but it's really useful for students. And it's got all the details of the exam. It's got sample papers. The B2 First and C1 Advanced has 2 sample exam papers. The C2 Proficiency, for some reason, only has 1. And that's my next tip. Do a lot of sample papers or exercises. There are a lot of websites out there now. And again, the Cambridge Handbook has sample papers. You could buy a book with sample tests or practice tests.
Is there a specific book you recommend?
Well, there's the Cambridge publications. When I recommend books for Cambridge exam preparation, I always recommend that students buy the Cambridge publications, because the questions that in the Cambridge English exams are written in a very particular way. And I've noticed that other books try to reproduce the style of Cambridge, but they don't always get it quite right. And also the answers that are accepted. Sometimes with the reading and use of English parts, for example, Cambridge would accept 1 or 2 different answers, whereas other publications with the answer key, they only accept 1, or they accept more that Cambridge wouldn't accept. So
I just wanted to add that apart from that, which I agree with, also I think other publications might not necessarily have the level correct. I've used course books in the past where it might be a lower level. It says it's B2 or it says it's C1. But really, when you're comparing it with past paper exams that they've given in the past, the level is not the same. It seems easier. So exactly. I agree with that.
Yeah. I think any past tests, past exam, like practice tests, you get the first books 1, 2, 3. There's certain books which only include like 4 complete practice exams. So they have all the sample papers of all the different parts. that's very useful. But also the trainer, so you have the first trainer and advanced trainer. So they include sample exercises, but also tips on strategy and how to approach the different parts of the exam. So advanced or first trainer. For proficiency, you also have objective proficiency, which is a big book, and it takes a while to get through. But again, it's a Cambridge publication, and that for me, I don't work for Cambridge. I don't represent Cambridge. I'm not sponsored by Cambridge, but I think it's just logical, and it makes sense to at least start with the Cambridge publications.
Yeah, maybe they should be paying you for promoting all their publications, but it's Cambridge University Press, and I will put links to the books that Ben's just recommended in the show notes, which again you can find at inglespodcast.com/Ben, B-E-N. So finally, Ben, one last question. What tends to prevent students from reaching their language learning goals and not passing a Cambridge exam when maybe you have had students or you've heard about students who haven't quite passed? What tend to be the things that stand out to you as the reasons why they didn't get a pass?
Yeah, a couple of personality traits, and the opposite personality traits, which I've observed, and it's overconfidence and underconfidence. So an overconfident student, and this is very typical, this situation where an English learner has a very good level of English. Imagine, and that maybe they use their English a lot. They watch all the films in English. They read books in English, listen to podcasts in English. They have a really good level. They're very confident with their English, and they just want to take an exam to validate, to have the certificate and to prove to everyone that they have this excellent level of English. So they don't prepare because they're too confident. They don't think it's necessary to prepare, or at least they don't prepare enough. For example, they don't do writing tasks, or they don't practice the speaking, or they don't really understand what is required of them. So they take the exam and they sit down and they open the paper, and then they just start, for example, the reading and use of English. They don't understand time management, which is extremely important because they haven't really looked into it. They haven't got to know the format, as I said, is very important. It's just because they're overconfident, they're a little bit cocky, and they don't. That maybe it's true. They really do have maybe a C2 level of English, but having the level does not mean you're going to pass the exam.
I was thinking of the word cocky as you were describing those kind of students. Yeah. A cocky person is someone who's overconfident, boasting about their English. They think they're really, really good and they don't need to study. Yeah, a cocky student.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and I think that's probably the biggest problem. I mean, this person may not be a cocky person in general. It's just that they're very confident with their level of English, and that's. But the strategy is so important, and I've seen this. It gets very frustrating, and I understand that. Students who have a good level, but they still can't pass the exam because they just don't understand what Cambridge is asking of them, and it's not only about having the level. Which it's very difficult to design an exam which is completely fair for everybody. Certain students find it easier to pass the Cambridge English exams than others, but you have to take it seriously and you have to get to know the format, do sample papers. And something I didn't mention before, but during the preparation process or period, when you're watching films or reading books or listening to podcasts, whatever, pay attention. Because when you're generally just doing these things for fun or maybe to improve your level, but if you don't have an exam to prepare for, people don't really pay attention and take notes of new vocabulary. One of the best things you can do to pass an English exam, is to expand your vocabulary, proactively expand your vocabulary, because it's so useful for the writing and speaking, but also for all the parts of the exam really. But I also mentioned underconfidence. So a student who doesn't feel that they're good enough to pass the exam, and they're constantly telling themselves that, my writing's not good enough, my speaking's not good enough. And at some point you just have to believe in yourself and go for it, because if you keep telling yourself you're not good enough, then you probably won't be good enough. An underconfident person is more likely to study and prepare more because they will never feel that they're ready. But I've seen students who keep delaying taking the exam, and then it becomes something very big in their lives, something intimidating and quite negative. And it should be fun if possible. I know preparing for and taking an exam is not usually fun, but it's a balance, because of course you have to take it seriously, but you don't want it to become something that's taking over your life. Some people really obsess about it because they don't feel that they're ever going to be ready. it's a balance. It has to fit into your life and be part of your life. And you have to remember your objective for taking the exam, whatever that may be. So yeah, somewhere between.
Somewhere in the middle.
Just be confident with your ability, but not overconfident. Yeah.
Yeah, somewhere in the middle. Don't overestimate the exam. Don't underestimate the exam.
Exactly.
And as Ben said, make sure you're well prepared for the format and the strategy and everything. I think that's excellent advice. Now, Ben, how can listeners find out more about your work, about you and your courses?
Probably YouTube channel. My YouTube channel, To The Point English with Ben, is the best place to start because you can find lots of my videos. Most of my videos, or a lot of my videos, are on Cambridge English exam preparation, but I also have vocabulary, grammar, some pronunciation videos. And you can find it in the descriptions to my videos, my contact details. But my website, which I need to spend more time on, but it does contain useful information and content, ttpenglish.com. So the TTP is for To The Point. So ttpenglish.com. I'm also on Instagram, To The Point English. I think you'll find me, but I need to be a bit more active on Instagram in the future, I think.
And of course, links to everything that Ben has mentioned will be in the show notes at inglespodcast.com/Ben. And Ben, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your knowledge on the Cambridge exams.
Thank you for having me, Craig. It's been great.
And now it's your turn to practice your English. Are you studying for an exam? If you are, what challenges are you facing at the moment? We would love to hear from you about exams or any comments, feedback, questions and ideas you may have after listening to this episode. Please get in touch. You can do that by our preferred method, which is sending a voice message so that you can practice your speaking. And you do that by going to speakpipe.com. That's speakpipe.com/Ingles podcast. Or you can send us an email with a comment or question. Write to me, Craig, Craig, at inglespodcast.com. And to reach my co-host, Reza, write to Belfast, Reza, that's Reza, at gmail.com. This podcast is sponsored in part by mansioningles.com. You can see our range of courses on the online store at store.mansioningles.net. And before I leave you for this week, I'd like to say a very heartfelt thank you to all of you who are helping us by supporting us on Patreon. You too can join the Patreon program for as little as $1.50 per month, and you get instant access to recent transcription so that you can read every word that you hear. You'll find more information on the website patreon.com/Inglespodcast. There isn't enough time, unfortunately, to thank everybody who is a Patreon supporter, but I will say thank you to recent supporters who have joined us this month, and they are Jose Francisco Prieto Lopez, thank you Jose, Concha de la Calle, hi Concha, Montse Carrasel Simon, hi Montse, Cesar Morales, Rosa Campos, Carlos Enrique, and Benjamin Segura, who is sponsoring us for more than the minimum amount. Thank you to you and to everybody who is on the Patreon program. If you enjoyed this podcast and you got some value from it, please tell a friend so that more people can listen. And until next time, it's goodbye from me. The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.